and prepare for a good life in the future. Bless our teachers who inspire and guide us. Bless our parents who work hard to support us. Bless our classmates and all the people who care for us. Bless us, help us to be more attentive, patient, and diligent to understand the lessons that we will tackle today. This we pray in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Good morning, sir. Good morning, classmates.
So good morning, guys. So today we'll continue the reporting for topic B, analyzing the pivot table. And I believe we stopped sa katong get pivot data function. So to continue, please go play Elaine. Thank you.
Nakatay table, naputay get pivot data function. So once you have a pivot table report, you may wish to extract a small portion to generate a summary of data if the pivot table is too large. Fortunately, Excel provides a get pivot data function as a way to show data from the pivot table elsewhere in Excel. So the syntax is equal sign get pivot data, and then you would just need to fill in the data field, the pivot table, and the field one, item one, field two, and item two, and so on. So the required arguments is the data field and the pivot table. So the data field contains the name of the enclosed quotation marks for the data field that contains the data that you want to retrieve. For example, total sales. So unsa man imong gipangita. So dapat imo siyang put under the data field. Now on the pivot table, a reference to any cell, a range of cells, or a named range of cells in the pivot table report. This information is used to determine which pivot table report contains the data that you want to retrieve. So let's put it in context. So here, ako lang siya ibalik to no calculations. So here, na instances na ang ato ang pivot table is daghan kayo maglisod ta og tan-aw. So if need ni mo one one information, lisod po kayo nga imong ipangita o sa imong daghan kayo nga pivot table. So why won't we just use the get pivot data function? So how would we use this? So unsa let's gives let's give an example kung unsa ito pangitaon. So what if we would find the total sales for the pen set? Okay. Now we would use the function get pivot data. Now we would require the data field to be filled up. So what are we looking for? So we are looking for the total sales for the pen set. So let's put here sales. Now we need to choose which pivot table are we using. So here we are using this pivot table, which gives us the location of I5. Now we are looking for the total sales for pen set. So ang atong ibutag na field item, one is product, comma, and then pen set. Apostrophe dito kung nabutan dito siya comma, guys. So, enter. So here we already have the total sales for pen set. So what if nakita ta for the total sale for pencils? So similar sa atong formula above, get pivot data, and then we would choose the data field sales, then the location of the pivot table, which is also I5, and then product. Then it would item one, pencil. So here we have the total sales for pencils. So that's how we use the get pivot data function. So that ends my report about the analyzing of the pivot table data. So the future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams. So if you have any question, guys, feel free to ask, feel free to raise, or you can chat me up in Messenger or MS Teams, and I will try my best to answer your questions. That is all. Thank you.
So for topic C, sir, we have Miss Trisha Tutur. Trish.
Gawad ako sa kuan, sa PPT. So, ano lang siya. Okay na. So, good morning, everyone. I am Trisha Tutor, and in this moment, I'll be talking about the topic C, which is the present data with pivot charts. So, this will be the introduction of this topic, which will be demonstrated by Melody Joy Pia later. So, next slide, please. So, pivot charts. Like standard Excel charts, pivot charts are graphical representation of numeric values and relationships among those values. So before this topic, my group mates showed us how to make pivot table, right? So to further understand that particular table, we are here to learn the pivot charts. So basically, as what I have said, it is a graphical representation of numeric values, so its main and primary use is to easily compare the data presented just by looking in these charts. So the main difference is simply that pivot charts are linked to pivot table data, whereas the standard charts are linked to either a range of data or a table. As with charts, when you alter the data in a pivot table, the pivot charts update automatically to reflect the changes. So the standard charts are linked directly to worksheet cells. So it is very limited compared to pivot charts, which are based on associated pivot table data source. You can easily manipulate or rearrange the pivot charts based on your liking or your needs. And it can also be linked or by using slicers, which will be the next topic. Ang main kalahian nila is that, as what I have researched, ang standard Excel charts kay if imuha siyang i-manipulate or like na kay usbon, dili siya direct or like automatically mo reflect sa mga cells nga imuhang gisun-an, whereas the pivot charts kay if kana either imo siya i-manipulate or mo siya hilabtan sa pivot table or sa pivot charts, mo automatic sila nga mo reflect sa ilahang kana mga data sa usag-usa. So Excel provides you with many of the same options for formatting your pivot charts, including the ability to change chart types as it does with charts. And the same consideration apply for deciding which chart type to select and what chart elements you should include in your pivot charts. You can use the Insert Chart dialog box to create pivot charts from pivot tables. To create a pivot chart, you can access the Insert Chart dialog box from the Charts group and under Insert tab or by selecting Analyze, then Tools, and Pivot Chart from the Pivot Table to Contextual tab. So this part will be demonstrated later by my partner. So next slide, please. So the pivot chart fields task pane. When you select a cell within a pivot table, Excel displays the pivot table fields task pane. Likewise, when you select a pivot chart or a pivot chart element, Excel displays the pivot chart fields task pane. These task panes are essentially the same. The only notable difference is that on the pivot chart fields task pane, the rows area appears as the axis area and the area appears as the legend area. Functionally, the two task panes are virtually identical. So, mo display ang pivot chart fields task pane if mo select ka og cells within a pivot table, and the same task pane ang mo display whenever mo select ka og elements sa pivot chart. So the table fields is a task pane associated with the pivot table. So next slide, please. So pivot chart filters. One of the added benefits of the pivot charts is that they include their own set of filters, which are linked to the filters on the associated pivot table. These filters correspond to the fields you drag on the columns and rows areas in the pivot table fields task pane, or the corresponding areas in the pivot chart fields task pane, and they display the same filter and sorting options available in the pivot table. So whether you filter or sort your data by using the option in the pivot table or the option in the pivot chart, Excel updates both objects simultaneously. By right-clicking the pivot chart filters, you have access to the same context menus that open when you select fields in the... Please focus kamay. Okay, so ang thank you. In the various areas at the bottom of the pivot table fields task pane or the pivot chart fields task pane. So the fields represent the columns in your data range or Excel tabs. So ang gist na good array is that you can manipulate the pivot chart by using filters or mag-sort the data. For example, so in this picture, it shows the data of Hicks, Hogan, Jordan, Ortega, and Williams. Sa mga cost nila sa east, north, south, west, and the total cost, which is represented also by the chart. So using the filters, pwede ra ngayong ipashow nimo is ang kang Hicks Baron or kang Hicks and Hogan. Depende sa imuhang need or kung unsay imong ganahan ma-compare. So, if imo sila i-filter as to, for example, ay mo i-filter ara nga data is kang Hicks o kang Hogan lang kasi sila ray mo i-compare usa. So Kang Hicks o ang Hogan imo ipa-show sa table, ang mo show sa pivot pivot table ang kang Hicks ra og kahogan nga mga data. So murag kuan bitaw sila like kanang di ba siya mirror like mo reflect siya kung unsa nga mga data ang mo reflect sa chart o unsa mga data ang mo reflect sa table. So after which human nimo pwede ra nimo gihapon siya ibalik. So sa unsa gyud ang iyahang display sa iyang normal display, but dili siya mausab ang iyahang data or dili mahilabtan ang mga mga data dira. So that ends my introduction. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. I am Melody Joy Pia, and I will be teaching you how you can present data with the use of pivot charts. Basically, what we are doing is converting the data that we have into charts for it to be visually appealing, simplified, and easy to interpret. So the first thing that you have to do is create a pivot table out of the data that you have. So this is the data that we have. The previous reporter already taught you how to make a pivot table, so I won't be delving that deep into that aspect. I will just quickly run through the process. So first is that you click Insert, click Pivot Table, and a dialog box will appear. The table and range are already filled, so all you have to do is click OK. After you click OK, you will be directed into a new sheet, and pivot table fields will appear on the right side of your screen. Just check the field that you wanted to analyze, and for this example, I will be using region, rep, and total cost fields. So drag them wherever you want, whether it be in the columns or rows. For this, I will be putting region under columns by dragging it. Now that our pivot table is ready, we can now proceed into making the pivot chart. So find Analyze under Pivot Table Tools and click it. So here. Next is click Pivot Charts and a dialog box will appear. And a dialog box will appear. So in the dialog box, you can see the types of charts that you can use. So there are columns, line, pie, bar, area, XY scatter, just to name a few. So these are all the charts that you can use. So this dialog box also showcases the different subtypes of the chart. So for the column, type of chart, there are 7 subtypes. So there's clustered column, stacked column, 100% stacked column, 3D clustered column, 3D stacked column, 3D 100% stacked column, 3D column. So for this example, we will be using the clustered column. So just select clustered column. And also when you hover the mouse in the preview of the chart, it will enlarge so that you can see the data. So after selecting clustered column and checking the data in the enlarged form, you can click OK. And the chart will appear in the same sheet with the table. So let me just move this. You can see the range of the sum of the total cost here, the name of the representatives here or the reps
here, as well as the region where the products were sold. The region were color coded for easy recognition: blue for central, orange for east, and gray for west. If ever that you wanted to see the performance of a specific rep or representative, all you have to do is click rep right here, the one with the arrow down, and a box will appear. Uncheck the box of select all and choose the member that you wanted to see. So let's say you wanted to see Howard's performance. So you just have to click Howard's name. Click OK. And the chart will display Howard's sale as well as the region, which is East. So let me just turn the table to how it originally looked to give another example. So that's how the table looked originally, right? So the next thing that you can do the same thing for region. So just click it, uncheck select all, and choose what region you would want to see specifically. So let's say you want to check the Western region. So you just click its box and click OK. Then boom, it will then display the sales in the region as well as the reps. So this are the sales for the Western region, like this sale 1,283 and 61 cents by the representative named Sorvino, 1,203 and 11 cents by the representative named Thompson. So let me just turn the table back to how it originally looked. So as you can also notice, whatever changes you made in a pivot chart also changes the data in the pivot table. So let me just do a quick undo and redo in case you didn't see it. So yeah, here. So it automatically updates. So you can also hover your mouse in the bars to see the details like the region, the rep, and the value of the sale. For example, this bar. So it displays Gill sales of 1,749 and 87 cents in the central region. You can see it stated in the pop-up thing. And the same thing happens when you hover your mouse on the other bars. So for this one, let's say Howard. So you can see the value of 536.75 in the eastern region. With Jardine, with Jones, with Kivel, with Morgan, with Parent, with Smith, Sorvino, and Thompson. So let's try another example with this pre-made pivot table. So let me just switch to that pre-made pivot table. So yes, we have this table right here. So the field that are in this table are region here, central, east, and west, and the products, which are desk, pen, pen set, pencil, and of course the grand total of the regions and the grand total of the respective products. So we just have to do the same thing. Click Analyze, click Pivot Chart. For this one, let's use 3D clustered column for a change. So yeah, you just have to click 3D clustered column, and when you hover your mouse, again, you can see a preview of what chart will be attached in your spreadsheet. So for this one, it will be this one. So just click OK. So let me just move the table right here. So for this chart, you can see that the products are being color coded. Blue represents binder, orange represents desk, gray represents pen, yellow represents pen set, and light blue represents pencil. So this chart compares the value of all the products sold. So we can see here in the central region, binder have the highest value, followed by pen set, then followed by pencil, and desk, then lastly pen. You can also see here for the east region, binder still have the highest value, then followed by pen set, then pen, then pencil, then here for the desk one, there's no value. Then the same thing with here, you can see that binder, desk, pencil, pen set. Then for Western region, you don't have pen set, a value for pen set. So if you wanted to see a specific comparison between the value of a specific product sold per region, just click product. The same thing that you did in the previous example, just uncheck select all and select the specific product that you want. So let's say for this example, it's binder. Just check binder, click OK, and the chart changes and the table also simultaneously updates or like simultaneously changes. So let me just turn the chart back to how it originally looked for another example. So if you wanted to see a specific comparison between the value of the product sold in a specific region, just click region right here. So the same thing, you just have to uncheck select all and choose the specific region that you wanted to see. So let's say central. Click OK. So the chart changes, bringing emphasis to the central region. And again, the table automatically updates based on the changes made in the chart. So let me just do a quick redo and undo so that you will be able to see. Right. So that would be all for pivot charts. Thank you for listening and thank you for watching.
So that ends our report for topic C, presenting data with pivot charts. So we'll go to our last topic, which is the topic D, another amazing feature from the Excel, which is filtering data by using timelines and slicers. So hi, good morning, everyone. I'll be discussing the last subtopic, which is filtering data by using timelines and slicers. So we have already learned in the past reporters that pivot tables are great for taking large data sets and creating in-depth detailed summaries. But sometimes we want the added flexibility of being able to further filter our data on the fly to a smaller portion of our pivot table. So the ability to filter your pivot tables enables you to drill down into your raw data to view the fine detail that lies within. So fortunately, there are several methods for filtering data. So there is slicer and Yanasai timeline. So first, let us talk about the slicers. So what are slicers? Slicers are pivot table filtering tools that you can link to various pivot tables in your worksheets. You can create a slicer out of any of the fields associated with the pivot table and then use those slicers to filter each field by any of its unique entries. So take note that you can only create a slicer out of any of the fields associated with the pivot table. Meaning, ang katong data nga wala sa imong pivot table, you cannot create a slicer from those. So slicers have buttons you can click to filter the data and they stay visible with your data. So meaning ana makita na to ang ato ang main nga pivot table o ang slicers nga atong hinimo out of that pivot table all at the same time. So it is for the reason that you always know what fields are shown or hidden in the filtered pivot table. So you'll appreciate it more, guys, in the workbook later on. Next is that we have here the slicer button. So mo siya ang mugawas, guys, if you create a slicer if you create a slicer out of your pivot table. So, ang giingon diri, slicer buttons may also appear slightly grayed out. So, unsa may meaning ana? Ang giingon, grayed out slicer buttons are inactive as you cannot filter on values that do not appear in the pivot table. So, potong giingon gaina nga ang nga dili ka maka dili ka maka-create og slicer out of data nga wala sa imong pivot table. So you cannot filter on values that do not appear on your pivot table. So clearing the filter that is suppressing the values from view will reactivate the associated slicer button. So mo na siya ang blue and white. So ang default slicer formatting yun is blue and white. But you can customize it, guys, to match your worksheet formatting. So na siya unya sa tab nga akong i-discuss. So you can place slicers anywhere in your worksheets or resize them as you like. You can even place copies of slicers in multiple locations, and the original slicer and the copies remain linked, so whatever you do to one affects the others. Next, we have here the Insert Slicers dialog box. So, mo siya ang makita once we click on the Insert Slicer. So you use the Insert Slicers dialog box to create slicers out of the various fields in your pivot tables. So each field appears as a checkbox option in the dialog box. So to create a slicer out of a particular field, check the associated checkbox. You can access the Insert Slicers dialog box on the Pivot Table Tools Contextual tab by selecting Analyze, then go to Filter, then clicking Insert Slicer. So, mo ni siya magawas if you click on the Insert Slicer. So, kaning mga date, quarter, mo ni sila ang mga fields sa imong pivot table. So, once you check on that, mo na siya ang magawas sa imong slicer. Mo na siya ang magawas sa imong slicer nga buhaton. So, if you check the region, the product, or ang rep, mo na siya ang slicer nga makita unya sa imong sheet if you press OK. We have the Slicer Tools Contextual tab. So you can access the commands you will use to work with pivot table slicers on the Slicer Tools Contextual tab. The Slicer Tools Contextual tab appears when you select a slicer and disappears when you select any non-slicer object. It contains only a single tab, the Option tabs. So mo na kung gaingon na nga pwede na to ma-customize ang ato ang slicers. So there are several cool things that we can do with our pivot table slicer, like customize them, filter them, connect them to multiple pivot tables, plus much more. So there are several different slicer styles available when you click on an Excel slicer. It is located in the Slicer Tools. In the ribbon under Options, Slicer Styles, kaning slicer styles. Pwede na to siya diri na siya change na to ang colors at ang slicers and mga arte-arte pa na. So you can also add columns to a slicer, and you can find more slicer options by right-clicking in a slicer. Normally, when you insert an Excel slicer, it is only connected to the pivot table that you are inserting it from, of course. So katong columns na siya diri sa buttons na apod sa sizes, pwede na to ma-ilisa ng size ato ang slicer according to our liking. Na po diri sa arrange, pwede na to ma-bring forward, send backward ang atong slicers. There is a slicer options kay pwede na to ma-rename ang ato ang slicers. So here, these are the types of commands to be found in the command groups on the Slicer Tools Contextual tab. So the types of command to be found in the command groups in the Slicer Tools Contextual tabs are slicer styles, arrange, buttons, size. So kani nga mga commands under slicer kay mas ma-appreciate ninyo unya no ug masabtan ni nato sa workbook. So basically what you will find here in the slicers contextual tab are commands that help enhance the view of our slicers. So you can customize it based on your liking. So kani slicer katong giingon na nga pwede ta maka-rename, and accessing slicer options and managing slicer connections to pivot tables. So, ato na siyang ma-discuss niya ang kanang slicer connections. And then we have also the slicer styles, katong ma-change ang color, depende sa atong ganahan, and then configuring the arrangements of slicers on screen, katong backward, katong send backward and bring front, align slicers with other objects, group slicers, and rotate the display of slicers. So depende nimo, pwede gid ka maka-customize sa imong slicer. Then we also have here buttons, modifying the size and alignment of slicer buttons. Changes you make here can also affect the size of the slicers themselves. So we also have here size, katong giingon nga pwede nimo siya ma-change ang size sa imong slicers. Pwede nimo pagamyan, pwede nimo pagpadak-an. Depende ra gid sa imuha kung unsa imong ganahan. Next, we have here the Report Connections dialog box. So you can access the Report Connections dialog box from the Slicer Tools Contextual tab by selecting Options and then go to Slicer and then Report Connections. So, excuse me. So the name of the field associated with the currently selected slicer appears in the Report Connections dialog box's title bar. So all pivot tables that are associated with the same raw dataset can share slicers. Take note of that, ha? All pivot tables that are associated with the same raw dataset can share slicers. These shared slicers affect all pivot tables that share them. So what you filter in one pivot table is filtered in all pivot tables that share the slicer. Sorry. So for you to better understand, let's have an example here. Wait, here. So in this workbook, we have two pivot tables, the region and category. So they are both based on the same sales data. So we have here the region, the city, the category, and some number fields. So in our pivot table sheet, one has a filter for the region. So we could look at just the data for the West. For example, kaning West. We have here the grand total of 5786. Sa kaning other pivot table, we also have here the grand total for the West of 5786. Okay, since they are both come from same sales data, so dira gid may bawa na to kung same ba sila. So we can see here the same total from other pivot table, and that's because they are based from the same data. So in Excel, you can add, as what we have discussed, we can add slicer for pivot tables, which makes it easier to filter the data. So what I'm going to do now is to add a slicer for this pivot table, so for this pivot table, and then later we'll connect it so it also controls the second pivot table. So first, para maka-insert taog slicer for this pivot table, will go. So na siya two ways on how to insert a slicer. First, pwede ta maka-add to sa insert. Then here's a slicer. And then, so, diba, here we have the region and the category. So might as well, as ato ang insert slicer, kaya ganahan ta nga i-connect sila sa duha, we'll make two slicers for region and the category. Okay. Ito kong giingon, guys, nga pwede siya ma-resize. Na siya. Dara ito nga para makita na to ang iyang connection niya. There you go. And then the second way that I in inserting a slicer is you select any cell sa imuhang selected pivot table, then we go to pivot table analyze, and then there is a filter. We have here insert slicer. O dira pareha gain na mo na siya ang mga fields nga available sa imuhang pivot table. So ang atong i-check diri ang katong data nga atong gusto makita sa atong slicer. So manaman ta, so ato na X. Okay, so because both of these pivot tables are based on the same sales data, we will be able to connect the second pivot table, kani siya, di ba, ang atong based on aning slicers, kaning duha is kaning first na pivot table. So, karon ang atong buhaton is ato i-connect ang kaning duha ka slicers into sa kaning pivot table 2. So, what we'll do is right-click on a slicer, right-click, right-click, and then we'll go with report connections Okay, so muna siyang report connections dialog box. So diri na mosud ang gamit sa report connections dialog box. So diri makita nato kung asa connected ang kaning slicer. So di ba gikan man ta nag-make ani from the kaning pivot table 1. So muna siya ang gi-check dira ang pivot table 1 na sad. So since naman tayo duha ka buok nga pivot table 2, ang kaning pivot table 2 pa man connect, so might as well let us check the box. So kana siya may bawaan na nato ay ato di clear ha. And then muna siya connected na ni nga slicer sa duha. So ang pagabalo, then we'll try. Example, east. Kita mo ato, ang east ra ang nakita diri sa region, ug ang east ra pod nga data ang nakita diri sa pivot table 2. Kaya ato na magi-connect ang kaning slicer, kaning region nga slicer sa kaning duha. And then for example, kaning west. Nigawas din ang west sa both nga pivot tables. So what we'll do now is kaning category. Unsaon man ni? Awa sa bars, cookies, adto pa man gihapon siya sa pivot table naka-connect. Syempre kay wala man nato siya gi-filter gaina. So how to do that? Pwede nato baliko na katong gibuhat gaina sa region katong right click and the report connections and the check sa pivot table, pwede ra pod na. Pero naay easier way in how to connect the pivot table 2 sa kaning category nga slicer. Wait, ako na. Report connections. Okay. So, the easier way is to select any cell on your pivot table 2 and then go to pivot table analyze and then go to filter connections. Click filter connections. And then, so, di ba, nakita diri kung asa nakakonect ang kaning specific slicer. So, asam siya nako-connect. So, syempre, adto siya sa region nga pivot table sa kanira. So, para ma-connect din ang slicer sa category, let us check the category box and press OK. So, kana. Nakita na ba ninyo, guys? So, amazing, right? Pwede na to ma-connect ang two slicers into two different pivot tables. But take note that these pivot tables are based on the same sales data here. So take note that we can only use the katong filter connections on the pivot tables that come from the same data or in this case from the same sales data. So ato siya i-try ha. So first bars. So nakita natin diri sa region nga pivot table kay sa bars ra po 2331 and diri po sa 2331 sa pivot table 2. So next is the cookies. So naa dira 2902 sa region nga pivot table and sa second nga pivot table nasa 2902. So mailhan gid mo siya nga they are from the same sales data kay they have the same kanang amount sad. Next is what if ganahan ko makabalo sa sum of quantity sa snacks sa east. Di ba? East and then grand total sa snacks. So there you have it, 717 sa pivot table 2, nasa 717 sa pivot table 1. So again, the report connections dialog box can be used to manage slicer connections. So this is very helpful, Jude, most especially for us future accountants, because we are faced with large amounts of data, so it can sometimes be too overwhelming to look at. So by using this slicer filtering tools Excel, it would be easier for us to view our data from a simpler perspective. So in effect, it will be easier for us to get the answers that we are looking for and thus helps us come up with an informed decision. Diba? And lastly, to clear the filters, guys, just clear the filter button in the slicers, kaning X, ano siya ang clear filter. Pwede siya click Alt and C. So, pwede siya ma-clear. And pwede siya ma-clear. And there you have it. You're back to seeing all the data in both pivot tables. So, let's move forward to the next topic. Okay, so we have here timelines. So timelines are pivot table filtering tools that you can link to various pivot tables in your worksheets. So instead of adjusting filters to show dates, you can use a pivot table timeline. It is a dynamic filter option that lets you easily filter by date or time and zoom in on the period you want with a slider control. So what are its advantages? If ako ang user, nga magamit ko kaning timelines, di ba? So timelines filter date fields and make it easy for users to see data that falls within the time period that they want to see. So also it can be used on a single pivot table or chart or on a multiple pivot tables and charts in the same report. So just like slicers, timelines are also interactive and user friendly. So next, we have here the insert timelines dialog box. So same gain na sa slicers. Mouse ni amo gawas once we click on the insert timeline. So you use the insert timelines dialog box to create a timeline out of the date fields in your pivot table. So again, maka-create ra pud ta og timeline same sa slicers sa based on sa data nga naa sa tong pivot tables. Other than that, we cannot create timelines or slicers on the data that ang the data nga wala sa atohang pivot table. So each field appears as a checkbox option in the dialog box. So to create a timeline out of a particular field, check the associated checkbox and you can access the Insert Timelines dialog box from the Pivot Table Tools Contextual tab by selecting Analyze to filter and then click Insert Timeline. So this is just like an ordinary tab where you can arrange or set how would you like your timeline to be presented. So the insert timeline dialog box is used for you to create a timeline based on the data given on your pivot table. So once you have created your timeline, it'll be reflected on your pivot table and on the pivot chart as well if needed. If you'd like to have it a you have if you like to have a pivot chart as well, you can adjust your timeline using this dialog box. Next is the Timeline Tools Contextual tab. So the Timeline Tools Contextual tab appears when you select a timeline and disappears when you select any non-timeline object. It contains only a single tab, the Option tab. So pareha gyud atong Slicer Tools Contextual tab. Nasa siya iyahang tab. Okay, so this is sayo itong gay na sa kuan guys katong reviews the insert timeline. So diri dito. So this is just like an ordinary tab where you can arrange or set how would you like your timeline to be presented. So as slicers, we also have here timeline, the timeline styles, the arrange, size, and show. We have here the types of commands to be found in the command groups on the timeline tools contextual tab. So we have here timeline styles, arrange, size, and show. So, timeline. Pareha tong sa slicers kay pwede sa siya ma-rename ang timeline, manage timeline connections to pivot tables, timeline styles, applying formatting to timelines, katong colors and stuff. Arrange, configuring the arrangement of timelines on screen. You may use the commands in this group to order timelines from front to back, align timelines with other objects, and group timelines. Size, you can also modify your size of the timeline and showing or hiding various elements on the timeline. So basically, pareha rin siya sa slicer command tab. What you will find here is kay tabs that help enhance the view of your timeline. So you can customize it pareha sa slicers based on your liking. So that would be all for the discussion part of this topic for this last topic, which is filtering data using timelines and slicers. So I hope you gained something and have a great day. Please wait lang sa workbook. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. So I will demonstrate how to insert timeline and slicers. So this is the pivot table and pivot chart. By using timeline and slicers, it will enable you and anyone else to view sales data in many ways. First, to insert a timeline, make sure that the pivot table is selected and the table and the chart can be seen clearly if necessary. So go to pivot table, tools, then analyze, filter, then click insert timeline and check order date and click OK. So this will be given, as you can see, you have options here. So by years, quarters, months, and days. By clicking one of these, data can be viewed differently. In years, you can see the sales made in the year 2020 or 2021. If you wanted to know the sales of quarter 1 on 2020, you can view it here by months and by days. So you can drag to analyze the data. So based on the data presented, for example, on the first quarter of 2020, the total sales is 2,075 pesos and 56 centavos. So you can even see the products sold and the respective sales on that duration. As you can see, the pivot table and the pivot chart will be updated. So in another nutshell. Next is the slicer. So to insert slicer, you need to select the pivot table under the pivot tools. So next is to click analyze. Under filter is insert slicer. So on this example, we will select regions and representative by checking the boxes and click OK. These options will pop up and we can use it to analyze the data. If we click only central under region, only the sales of the central region will show with all these representatives. So that we can find out the sales made by each representatives by a certain region. Just click the name, for example, Andrews on central region. As you can see, the pivot table and the pivot chart are updated. So the sales made by Andrew in the central region is 298 pesos and 65 centavos. You can also select multiple options to analyze the data more. For example, how much sales Andrews made in the central and east region. So ang buhatan ana, just click this icon to multi-select. As you can see, Andrews did not make sales on the east region. So also this icon is to clear filter. So that would be all. Thank you.
That's all for group 5 now, pivot. Tama ba?
Yes.
Okay. So, we don't have time left, man, but just to set expectation to everyone now. Actually, I prepared an activity, a very simple activity for pivot. So, by Friday, I'll give that time for you guys to practice. Now, especially for those students now who haven't tried with pivot. But if you have tried already doing this during senior high or your previous years, definitely it would be a walk in the park. No? So as simple as how to do pivot. No? I'll be giving data and then you will just have to pivot it based on the instructions that I have given. No? So there's a task that you need to complete, but maybe we will just do it by next week, no? So Monday, expectation, we will report or start reporting with group 6, and then Wednesday, I might we might have an activity for that, no, for the pivot. And this Friday, I will not give the activity lang sa para at least you can review, and also you can have time to to use our schedule to do the SSC election na, so para at least di kayo mo bombarded with activities. All right, so any questions from the class so far?
None so far.
None. Okay.
Yeah, sir.
So far,
All right,
sir.
so let's call it a day. That's all for today, and I'll see you guys next week. Thank you for joining for today. Have a great one, guys.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye,
sir.
sir.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
sir.
Thank you,
Thank you,
sir.
sir.
Thank you, sir.